They say darkness doesn't appear suddenly. It approaches slowly, first as a whisper, then as a choice. And when we realize it, it has already become destiny. What if I told you that the fall of the 9 kings began long before the rings shone on their fingers? Long before Sauron revealed his true face? Long before the future king of the Nazgûl abandoned his own name to become merely an echo of terror? What truly transforms powerful men into obedient shadows? What makes a king relinquish his own soul in exchange for a power he doesn't understand? And why would Frodo, centuries later, feel the weight of that decision in the tranquil hills of the Shire? There is a hidden truth in this story, one that is rarely told, about ambition, fear, and a promise so irresistible that no human being could refuse it. A truth that begins in Minas Ithil, crosses entire kingdoms, and ends in the waters of Bruinen, where the light finally dared to confront the shadow. Get ready, because today you're going to understand the transformation that sealed the fate of Middle-earth, and how every step of the Nazgûl still resonates in the world to this day. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there now? I'd like to know how far this story is going, and if this journey captivates you right away, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to continue walking with me through the darkest corners of Middle-earth. Let's delve into the story. Before the rings. Of power existed, even before the One Ring was forged in the fires of Orodruin, the Second Age breathed a watchful silence, as if the very air knew that something was about to shatter the balance of the world. The kingdoms were vast, gilded by the pride of men who believed they had reached the pinnacle of their own greatness. Their names echoed in marble halls, in troubadour songs, and in legends that traveled between mountains and valleys. But behind all this glory, there was a subtle unease, an emotional shadow that none of them confessed. The fear of disappearing, the fear that their crowns, so heavy and so bright, would turn to forgotten dust. And it was precisely this detail, this silent fear, that shaped their deepest decisions. On the outside, they displayed the image of firm, unwavering, almost invincible kings. But behind the scenes of their own minds, they harbored doubts, insecurities, questions about legacy, influence, purpose. Their mentality oscillated between the greatness they had achieved and the human frailty they tried to hide behind titles and victories. It is this contrast, this hidden truth, that reveals how vulnerable even the most powerful of men can be when the subject is eternity. The beauty of Middle-earth at that time was almost cruel. Untouched forests, rivers that reflected the moon like silver mirrors, cities built with architecture so elegant they seemed to defy time itself. And yet, even in such a harmonious world, there was an omen, a feeling akin to the cold breath that precedes a storm. The ancient peoples murmured of forgotten powers, of the return of an evil that had once been defeated. They didn't speak aloud, but everyone felt it. It was like watching the horizon and noticing a dark line slowly approaching. The kings, each on their throne, thought they could control this feeling. They believed that fear was merely a passing weakness, something that could be erased with more gold, more territory, more authority. But the truth was simple and devastating. No amount of human power could fill the void in a soul that fears being erased from history. And it is precisely in this space, in this interval between pride and insecurity, that the deepest danger finds its way. Later chroniclers claim that the fall of the 9 did not begin when they accepted the rings. No, it began much earlier, when they allowed the need for recognition to become greater than humanity itself. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process, like the first cracks that appear in a seemingly indestructible wall. In their personal journeys, each of them sought more than power. They sought meaning. They sought that which no sword, no army, no treasure could guarantee permanence. It is this desire, as old as humankind itself, that has transformed the Second Age into fertile ground for manipulation, ambition, and carefully constructed illusions. And when a whisper began to circulate between mountains and borders, a whisper that spoke of strength beyond death, of dominion beyond time, many closed their eyes to the ancient danger that accompanied it. They heard, but did not understand. They felt, but did not retreat, because no one retreats when they believe they have found the path to never be forgotten. That's why this story isn't just about magic and darkness. It's about decisions, those that seem small at first, but carry enough impact to change the fate of an entire era. It's about transformation, about the thin line between ambition and ruin, about the journey of men who sought eternity and found only shadows. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. When Sauron returned to walk Middle-earth, he did not appear as the shadow that all feared, nor as the declared enemy whose armies had already devastated ancient kingdoms. He appeared exactly as the kings wished to see him, an ally, a master of creation, a bearer of answers to the anxieties they hid even from themselves. His carefully sculpted appearance was beautiful, serene, almost luminous. Nothing about that figure suggested threat. On the contrary, he seemed to bring balance to a world that was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. It was this combination of calm presence and sharp intelligence that made anyone lower their guard before they even realized it. The title he chose for himself, Lord of Gifts, was no exaggeration. He knew exactly what to offer. He didn't speak of domination, wars, or control. He spoke of stability, prosperity, and continuity. He spoke as one who knew the human soul intimately, as one who understood the inner workings of the minds of great leaders. And he truly did. He observed every gesture, every silence, every hesitation, searching for that hidden truth that no one admitted in public, the fear of decline. It's curious how, even surrounded by riches, these kings carried within themselves a feeling of inadequacy, as if everything could crumble in the blink of an eye. It was at this vulnerable point that Sauron's promises found fertile ground. He offered ancient knowledge, far beyond the comprehension of men. He spoke of the transformation of empires, of how the right decisions at the right time could guarantee not only power, but permanence. He used words that resonated like music: destiny, legacy, influence, strength, exactly what they wanted to hear. And as he spoke, he presented pieces of craftsmanship so perfect they seemed alive. The rings, still in their early stages, shone as if each carried a spark of eternity. Nothing in his approach resembled direct manipulation. It was an intellectual, spiritual, and emotional seduction. He guided the kings not with orders, but with suggestions, small nudges, a seemingly innocent question here, a strategic observation there. And little by little, he planted the mentality that accepting his gifts was not a sign of weakness, but of vision, a revelation disguised as an opportunity. The psychological impact of this was profound. They began to believe that Sauron saw something in them that even his own advisors did not perceive, a kind of greater importance, an almost prophetic calling. But the hidden truth, the one Sauron would never reveal, is that the need he aroused was not natural. It was molded, ingeniously woven into conversations, glances, precise compliments. He made each king feel chosen, as if the rings were destined for specific hands. And who would refuse such a thing? Who would deny a gift that promises to amplify talents, strengthen nations, protect borders, and transform fears into power? None of them imagined that each promise came with a price hidden among the runes. When Sauron finally presented the finished 9 rings, he didn't order them to accept them. He simply let ambition fill the silence. The kings took them willingly, believing they were facing the greatest opportunity of their lives. The initial feeling was indescribable. Vigor, mental clarity, almost infinite energy. A gift too perfect to raise suspicion. And that was precisely what made it all the more dangerous. The trap had no chains or threats. It had admiration, gratitude, trust. In the eyes of the kings, that moment seemed like the beginning of a new era of glory. But in Sauron's mind, it was merely the first move in a carefully orchestrated plan to dominate not their bodies, but their souls. The beauty of the deception lay in its simplicity. He took nothing, he only gave. And that is why none of them realized that, by accepting the rings, they offered something far more valuable in return. They surrendered their own autonomy. It's strange to think how a gift can become a prison. How something given with the appearance of a blessing can transform into the origin of a destiny that no one would consciously choose. But it is precisely here that the true downfall of the Nine begins. Not with violence, but with gentleness. Not with imposition, but with choice. A choice that seemed brilliant on the surface, but dark as pitch when seen from within. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. When the rings finally reached the hands of the Nine Kings, there was no resistance, no questioning, no hesitation. It was as if each of them had been waiting for that very moment, that opportunity capable of validating years of effort, battles, and sacrifices. Sauron's gift seemed tailor-made for each of their pride, expanded power, an authority that no other mortal could contest, and above all, the feeling that they were surpassing limits that previously belonged only to the great elven warriors. It was not just an object, it was a promise of transcendence. And who, faced with such a possibility, would dare to say no? The moment each king placed the ring on his finger was almost identical, despite the differences between their kingdoms, cultures, and temperaments. First came the warmth, a kind of silent energy that rose up the arm, crossed the chest, and spread like controlled fire. Then, an unprecedented mental clarity, as if the whole world had become clearer, more understandable, more manageable. They felt physical strength, increased stamina, and above all, absolute mastery over their own emotions. It seemed like pure transformation, the kind that changes not just a ruler, but the entire mentality of an empire. But the most seductive impact wasn't on the body. It was on the mind. The kings began to experience faster, sharper, almost premonitory thoughts. They could foresee political movements, read hidden intentions, and understand complex strategies with a naturalness that would previously have taken days of reflection. They felt they were, at last, on the same level as the legends. It was no exaggeration. The rings made each of them see themselves as destined for an eternal chapter in history. The vanity, which already existed, grew silently but powerfully. That's where the hidden truth emerges, one that few notice immediately. The clearer their thoughts seemed, the more vulnerable they became to external influences. Because that very night, the first night with the rings, something began to stir within the shadows of their minds. First, a distant whisper, so soft it could be mistaken for consciousness itself. Then short phrases, almost like innocent suggestions. Keep a closer eye on your allies. Be wary of that advisor. Protect your kingdom before someone else does. Nothing aggressive, nothing that seemed manipulative, just small. Provocations that seemed perfectly aligned with the real concerns of each king. And that's how the trap begins. Not by destroying their will, but by enhancing the instincts that already existed within them. The ring didn't impose orders. It reinforced fears, ambitions, and insecurities that were already part of each person's personality. It was as if the object amplified what they hid from themselves. and in the process, autonomy gradually disappeared, replaced by a feeling of dependence that they couldn't yet recognize. During the following nights, the dreams began to change. They ceased to be random memories and became visions, some grandiose, others disturbing. The kings saw themselves leading invincible armies, conquering distant lands, dominating entire peoples with absolute ease. But they also saw themselves facing invisible threats, imminent betrayals, dangers that seemed so real that they awoke them in silence, bathed in anxiety. The line between prophecy and paranoia began to become indistinct. The most curious thing is that none of them realized that the dreams were identical from one kingdom to another. No one suspected that the same images, the same sensations, the same regrets and desires were running through minds separated by mountains and borders. Such precise synchronicity could only have an external origin. But the kings, blinded by their own vanity, interpreted it as signs of greatness, as revelations destined only for the chosen ones. And so, without realizing it, they began to make different decisions. Small adjustments to domestic policies, unexpected changes to diplomatic treaties, a more aggressive tone in strategic meetings. Nothing that immediately caught their attention, but enough to unsettle advisors and generals. The ring was shaping not only the man, but the entire kingdom around him. The seed of servitude had already been duly planted. It didn't seem like servitude, it seemed like evolution. It seemed like progress, a decisive moment, a step towards something greater. Ambition was calling the shots, while each king's perception was already beginning to mix with intentions that weren't his own. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Minas Ithil had always been known as the City of the Moon, a place where the light seemed to rest more gently on the white walls, as if time there had a different rhythm. It was a haven of peaceful beauty, a symbol of balance between strength and serenity. But when the kings began to receive the summons to gather there, something in the city's atmosphere was no longer the same. The light that once reflected on the towers now seemed timid, almost intimidated. The shadows lengthened too quickly, as if rushing to occupy every corner. And even before any explanation, even before Sauron's arrival, the cold settled in. Not a natural cold, but an icy silence that touched the soul. The kind of feeling that makes one look back without knowing exactly why. Each king arrived with his entourage, but it was enough to cross the gates to realize that the environment was strangely deserted. Soldiers walked more slowly, servants spoke more softly, and even the animals seemed restless, as if they could sense a danger that mortals did not yet understand. It was as if the city were breathing irregularly, awaiting something that no one dared to name. The transformation of Minas Ithil began there, in the seemingly insignificant details that reveal a hidden truth. The world knows when an ancient force awakens. When the kings finally met in the Great Hall, they realized they all shared the same unease, even though they tried to disguise it. There was a weight in the air, a feeling of surveillance, as if the walls, floor and ceiling were watching their every move. For the first time, they felt they didn't completely control the power they carried on their fingers. The ring, which had previously seemed to amplify their abilities, now had a presence of its own. Silent, but insistent. It was as if a second consciousness had awakened within each of them, interpreting, judging, interfering with thoughts that were once genuine. The most unsettling thing was that none of them could admit it aloud. How could they admit that this much-desired gift was beginning to invade spaces in their minds that should have been inviolable? How could they confess that decisions that had always been clear now seemed riddled with planted doubts, like seeds germinating in the darkness? The king's once firm mindset began to waver. Their confidence seemed intact on the outside, But inside, each waged an invisible battle between pride and intuition, and deep down, they all shared the same silent question: to what extent does this power truly belong to us? The meeting in Minas Ithil had no defined agenda, yet everyone was there, as if a greater force had guided them without their realizing it. And that's precisely what revealed the first sign that something was wrong. They hadn't been invited, they had been summoned. The call they received was more than a request. It was an irresistible, almost automatic impulse. None of them could simply ignore, postpone, or question it. They came because they felt they needed to come, and that realization in itself was already a breach of the autonomy they so cherished. While they waited for the unseen host, they observed that the moon, which should naturally illuminate the city, seemed to hide behind clouds that didn't exist. The familiar glow of Minas Ithil was weakened, as if the star itself avoided looking directly at the city. It was a clear omen, but none of them dared to name it. They perceived the change, but clung to the idea that it was all just nervousness, coincidence, or perhaps an adaptation to their newly acquired power. The human mind has this tendency. It prefers to rationalize fear rather than accept it. When Sauron's presence finally made itself felt, it wasn't with footsteps, nor voice, nor sudden appearance. It was a subtle drop in temperature. A simultaneous shiver ran down everyone's spine, a silence that seemed deeper than it should have been. And in that instant, each king realized deep inside that they had crossed an invisible threshold. The ring on their finger pulsed slightly, as if recognizing its true master. And this realization brought with it an uncomfortable revelation. The power they thought they controlled was, in fact, beginning to control them. The meeting at Minas Ithil marked the beginning of the subjugation, not because Sauron imposed his will directly, but because the kings felt, on a level they couldn't explain, that their will had been shaped for a long time. The journey to greatness was beginning to transform into a journey of dependence. This feeling of being driven by something greater, something that came from within and without at the same time, was the first real warning that the path to freedom was beginning to narrow. And it is precisely at this moment, when the city lights dim and the hidden truth begins to emerge, that the story takes a turn. Because what seemed like just a meeting between kings would become the first step towards the loss of everything they considered sacred. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Corruption didn't begin with a snap, nor with a dramatic revelation. It settled in like a thin, almost imperceptible fog, enveloping each king with such calculated delicacy that none of them realized the exact moment they ceased to be the protagonist of their own story. In the beginning, everything seemed just another natural effect of the power they wielded. The absence of hunger was seen as efficiency. The lack of fatigue was celebrated as renewed vigor. And that strange emotional serenity, which erased irritations and anxiety, seemed like an unexpected gift. But what they didn't realize was that each advantage came with a silent price. The gradual loss of everything that made them men. As the days passed, small details began to catch his attention, not as alarms, but as uncomfortable curiosities. One king realized he could no longer smell the flowers in his own garden, something that had once reminded him of his youth. Another noticed that the colors of the world were less vibrant, almost as if someone had placed a veil before his eyes. The food seemed tasteless, the wine no longer brought warmth, and even the touch of loved ones caused only a distant sensation, as if the body were present, but the soul were a few steps behind. It is in this kind of change that the hidden truth resides. The most dangerous transformation is always the one you only see when you are already trapped in it. The kings tried to rationalize everything. They told themselves they were merely adapting to a new level of existence. One of them even proudly stated that it was a small price to pay for their newly acquired strength and authority. Their mindset had already changed. And this is an important point. Corruption begins when you transform a loss into a justification. When you start to believe that giving up your own humanity is part of the journey to something greater. They saw everything as evolution, when in reality it was erosion. And although the physical changes were subtle, it was in the internal changes that the real impact manifested itself. Emotions became rarefied. Joy no longer filled the chest. Sadness no longer weighed heavily. Guilt no longer burned as before. The absence of sensations seemed liberating at first, but soon revealed itself to be an emptiness difficult to ignore. The gaze of each one, once lively, full of ambition and personality, began to lose its shine. It was as if the inner light that distinguished each king was slowly fading, replaced by something colder, more automatic, more obedient. When they looked at their reflections in polished mirrors, they noticed that something was out of place. Nothing as drastic as a deformity, but a subtle detail, the feeling that the reflection no longer perfectly matched the movement. A minimal delay, almost imperceptible, but real. A disharmony between the physical body and the essence that should inhabit it. And this type of perception, even without explanation, provokes a discomfort that no one dared to admit. After all, to admit it would be to acknowledge that something greater than themselves was taking control. Gradually, they also began to realize that no idea arose spontaneously. Old opinions, values, and principles they had carried since their youth began to disappear, as if they had been erased from memory. Their decisions became more rigid, more calculated, more aligned with a force they could not name. There was no longer room for doubt or internal debate. The ring offered ready-made answers, solutions that seemed perfect and immediate. Critical thinking was replaced by instinctive convictions that did not belong to them. And that is where the invisible corruption lies. The ring not only strengthens, it occupies spaces. It erases, replaces, reshapes. And it does so subtly that each king believed he was in control, when in reality he was merely a conduit for the will of something much older and much more powerful. They still walked like men, spoke like men, ruled like men, but inside the structure was crumbling. Identity disintegrated like diluted ink in water. The transformation was progressing silently. What were once kings with temperaments, histories, memories and personalities were becoming something uniform. The same emotional pattern, the same coldness, the same absence. They were ceasing to be individuals and becoming fragments of a larger consciousness which observed them through every whisper, every distorted dream, every suspiciously easy decision. The path to spectral form does not begin with the loss of the body, it begins with the loss of the soul. And each step they took, each night they heard that gentle voice guiding. Their thoughts, each sensation that vanished without warning, brought them closer to what they would one day become. Obedient shadows, eternally shaped by the will of the One. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. When Sauron finally advanced upon Minas Ithil, it was not merely a territorial conquest, it was a spiritual rupture, an event that marked the point of no return in the journey of the Nine. The city, known for its silvery light and the almost sacred tranquility emanating from its walls, became the stage for a transformation so profound that even the geography itself seemed to react. Before the first blow was struck, the inhabitants already sensed that something terrible was approaching. The nights grew denser, the mist began to rise from the valley like hands trying to grasp everything that still breathed, and the shadows on the walls moved even when there was no wind. It was as if the city sensed its own downfall. Sauron's arrival lacked the typical roar of a common conqueror. It was silent, methodical, almost ritualistic, a symbolic violence that struck deeper than any sword. When his armies breached the gates, a wave of darkness spread like ink spilled on a white cloth. And what is striking is that this change did not occur only in the physical world. The light of the lamps seemed to flicker. The gleam of the river surrounding the city became murky, stagnant. The air began to acquire an odor of old dampness, as if decomposition had been summoned. Even before it began, this environmental impact was not a simple consequence. It was a signature, a mark that this city now belonged to another kind of force. The Nine, already deeply connected to the rings, felt something within them awaken or fall asleep forever. It was as if an inner door, until then ajar, had been flung wide open. Sauron's dominion over Minas Ithil had definitively activated the invisible link he had built piece by piece, choice by choice, whisper by whisper. The sensation did not come as a shock, but as an involuntary surrender. Many would describe this experience as the final dissolution of free will. The kings felt their thoughts rearranging themselves, as if their minds had lost their boundaries and merged with something much larger and much colder. It was no longer a matter of influence or suggestion. Now it was control. The voice that had previously appeared as subtle advice had settled in as a constant presence. There was no more internal debate, questioning, or memories that could offer resistance. Their mentality was molded into a perfect reflection of the power that guided them. And this is perhaps the most bitter revelation. The final moment of corruption does not arrive with explicit violence, but with the false calm of those who no longer fight. They ceased to be kings and became exactly what Sauron intended from the beginning. Extensions of his own will, tools of a purpose they did not fully understand, but obeyed without hesitation. As Sauron transformed Minas Ithil into Minas Morgul, the city reacted to the new essence that filled it. The light that was once white became greenish, sickly, as if emanating from within a wound that would never heal. The river that crossed the valley grew dark, almost viscous, reflecting not the sky, but the evil that now dominated those lands. The surrounding vegetation began to die, not from fire or direct destruction, but because the very energy of the place had been corrupted. It was the birth of a new center of power, not a kingdom, but a portal between the world of the living and the realm of shadows. The Nine witnessed this transformation as both witnesses and victims. They still had human form, but they were no longer human. Their bodies remained, but their essence dissolved with each breath. Some tried to grasp old memories, the face of a child, the voice of a wife, the sound of a victory, but everything slipped like water through their fingers. The inner structure that had once sustained who they were crumbled completely. Each became an empty vessel, ready to be filled by whatever Sauron desired. The consummation of their doom arrived when, together, they crossed the great, now altered hall of Minas Morgul. The walls gleamed with a sickly green. Strange symbols seemed to move in the stones. The floor exuded a coldness that did not come from the weather, but from the very energy that circulated there. As they crossed that space, the Nine felt the last spark of autonomy vanish. It was no longer possible to distinguish where their thoughts ended and Sauron's began. The entire journey, from the initial pride to the whispers, the decisions, the physical and emotional changes, culminated in that silent and devastating instant. They had become servants of the ring. And perhaps the most tragic aspect of this stage is the simplicity with which it occurs. There were no screams, no epic resistance, no visible internal battle. There was only the sudden awareness that they no longer existed as individuals. The final loss of free will did not happen with noise, but with silence. And it is in this silence that the true figure of the Nazgûl is born. Not kings, not men, not warriors, but shadows that obey, hunt, and exist only to serve the One. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The night the 9 kings vanished from the world didn't begin with thunder, screams, or some grand catastrophe. It began with silence. A silence so profound, it seemed to swallow the light, as if the very air had decided to stop vibrating. Inside the newly corrupted walls of Minas Morgul, the torches burned strangely, with greenish flames that didn't warm, only cast long, irregular shadows across the walls. And it was precisely these shadows that moved first, not the kings. As if the darkness, finally free, was reclaiming what belonged to it. The 9 stood there, in a circle, each still bearing the appearance of a man, but now distant from everything they had once been. There was no longer a sparkle in their eyes, no quickened breathing, no sign of life that could distinguish a body from a memory. The process had begun long before, it's true, but that night it concluded. Symbolic death, the abandonment of the last human spark, irreversible transformation. Some still tried to cling to isolated memories, a forgotten childhood, an old vow, a beloved name, but it was useless. The memories slipped away like leaves carried by the wind. Nothing remained that could be called an identity. Shadows began to creep up the legs of each king, like icy water flooding a doomed ship. But this darkness didn't just engulf their bodies, it pierced their flesh, plunged into their essence, dissolved the inner contours that sustained each one's personality. There was no physical pain. Pain, ironically, was the first thing they lost. What remained was a profound estrangement, as if each thought were being ripped away and replaced by a distant echo. From that moment on, the name they bore no longer mattered. They became what Sauron had always wanted, empty vessels, malleable, obedient. And then something happened that would be impossible to describe as sound. But it wasn't silence either. It was a murmur, a dragging of ancient voices that seemed to come from all sides at once. The very walls of Minas Morgul vibrated with this whisper. It was at that instant that the voices of the kings vanished forever. Everything that had been speech, opinion, personality became just an indistinct murmur, incapable of forming words. They no longer communicated. They merely existed in the form of intention, an intention that was not their own. As the night wore on, their bodies began to lose density. They didn't disappear dramatically. They dissolved like light dust, like mist dispersed by a wind no one felt. Their clothes remained, their armor remained, but their flesh became an empty space between the physical world and the invisible world. Each one became a presence, a transparent silhouette, a trail of shadow that moved silently. It was the final stage of the transformation. No longer kings, no longer men, but specters. And at the center of it all, before the other 8, emerged the one who would be the most feared of all. When his shadow formed, it was denser, more defined, colder. His presence filled the space as if larger than his own body. There, the king of the Nazgûl was born, the future witch king of Angmar. He said nothing, nodded, looked, just era, and this simple act, existing in this new state, imposed absolute silence on everyone else. The psychological impact of this was enormous. That night, the world gained a new figure of terror, an entity capable of bending wills, provoking despair and toppling kingdoms without needing to lift a sword. The 8 who accompanied him formed a circle behind him, like condemned brothers sharing the same sentence. Each had a slightly different form, taller, narrower, more stooped, but they all shared that unmistakable trait, a total absence of identity. Their names, which once sustained entire lineages and echoed across vast territories, were swallowed by oblivion. History did not erase them, they erased themselves. When the wind finally broke through the city walls, something shifted in the air of Middle-earth. Distant villagers awoke with inexplicable chills. Animals hid without knowing why. Experienced warriors felt their hearts clench, as if sensing a threat. Yet faceless, it was the first reverberation of the birth of the Nazgûl, a silent impact that marked the beginning of an era of fear and uncertainty. That night would never be accurately recorded in the books, but its effect would shape the future of entire peoples. The world had changed, the balance had been broken, and what rose in place of the king's former glory was something far more dangerous. 9 shadows united by a single purpose, guided by a force they could not defy and could never abandon. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The Nazgûl's first mission was not merely a test, it was the final blow that defined who they would be from then on. After being reborn as shadows, Sauron gave them no time to comprehend their condition. There was no pause, reflection, or adaptation. From that moment on, their existence would be continuous action, without rest, without hesitation, without alternative. And that is precisely why the Dark Lord chose a task that combined forbidden power, absolute secrecy, and total obedience to recover a Palantir. An artifact that would not only allow him to watch his enemies, but would also give him the emotional key to definitively dominate those he had just shaped. The Nazgûl departed from Minas Morgul like shadows creeping across the ground. There were no footsteps, no sound of armor, no breathing. They simply moved forward as if they were part of the night air. Those who saw them from afar might think they were specters that had sprung from nowhere, but the hidden truth lay behind the scenes of this journey. Each of their movements was guided directly by the will of Sauron, as if they were fingers of the same hand. There was no strategy of their own, no individual thought. They followed an inner calling that vibrated like an inevitable command. The place where the Palantir was guarded, an ancient fortress protected by trained and loyal men, never imagined facing anything like this. The Guardians always believed they could hold their position against entire armies if necessary. But no one was prepared to face enemies who feared no pain, did not recoil from injury, and whose presence made the air feel as heavy as lead. When the Nazgûl emerged from the darkness, the soldiers first felt the change in temperature, then a metallic taste in their mouths, and only then did they perceive hooded figures advancing with cold determination. The attack was as silent as it was devastating. The black blades of the Edger specters pierced the air with a precision no human could imitate. Their touch not only cut, it drained. It took away strength, hope, courage. Each blow left a shadowy trace in its wake, as if part of the victim remained trapped there. The men who tried to resist quickly realized they were not fighting warriors, but an idea, the idea of inevitable death, of the absence of a future, of the complete annihilation of will. The brutality of the action lay not in the bloodshed, but in the absolute coldness with which the Nazgûl carried out their mission. There was no emotion, anger, pleasure, or urgency, only fulfillment, only objective. And this kind of mentality, almost mechanical, almost automatic, evidenced the impact of the transformation that had already consumed them from within. It was like watching the execution of a ritual, not a battle. Every second there was a reminder that those beings were no longer men. When they finally reached the central hall, they found the Palantir. Resting on a stone pedestal, the sphere, seemingly inert, appeared to pulse with internal light whenever anyone approached too closely. It was not merely an artifact, it was an intense focus of energy capable of revealing secrets, connecting consciousnesses, and bending destinies. The Nazgûl approached without hesitation, and what happened in that instant sealed something greater than a simple mission. It sealed Sauron's absolute dominion over them. When the first Nazgûl touched the fabric that enveloped the Palantir. The sensation was immediate. The world seemed to contract into a single point. A familiar, cold and cutting energy filled the air. The eye, not physical but present, opened within the sphere. There was no sound, but everyone heard. There was no light, but everyone saw. And at that very moment, something definitively shattered within each of them. If before there was still a distant fragment of humanity, a disconnected memory, a trace of who they were, it dissolved like smoke. With the Palantir in his possession, Sauron not only saw what he wanted, he saw through the Nazgûl. The connection intensified, becoming an indestructible chain. They lost any capacity to resist, question, or feel. There was no longer choice, doubt, or hesitation. Every thought was aligned, every impulse calibrated, every instant of existence surrendered to the will of the Dark Lord. It was there that the person ended and the function began. The Nazgûl left the fortress carrying the Palantir with the same silence with which they had arrived. Behind them only motionless bodies and corridors, immersed in a cold that seemed never to dissipate. The fortress did not fall from destruction. It fell from emptiness, from despair, from an immeasurable terror that no one could describe. And when the spectres disappeared into the night, they took with them not only the artifact, but the last trace of who they had been. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. When the first rumors crossed the walls of Mordor, carried by the wind like urgent whispers, Sauron already knew they were not mere hearsay. Something had awakened in the west, an ancient force, a distant echo he recognized immediately. The One Ring, lost for so long that many believed it to be only a worn-out legend, had been seen again. It didn't matter how or by whom. For him, the mere possibility was enough. The order needed no repeating, explanation, or justification. It sprang from within the minds of the Nazgûl as an absolute command. Find the bearer, and at the instant that sentence was formed, Middle-earth began to change. The Nazgûl mounted their black horses as if emerging from a tear in the very fabric of night. The air around them grew heavy, laden with a cold that didn't come from the weather, but from the lifelessness that accompanied each of those spectres. There were no trumpets announcing their departure, no flags fluttering in the wind. They simply moved as if they were shadows, themselves taking shape and direction. And as they advanced, the boundaries between the world of the living and the world where hope begins to falter became ever more tenuous. The emotional impact of their passing was immediate and profound. Entire villages fell silent before the riders appeared on the horizon. Doors were hastily closed, windows locked, and even animals cowered in dark corners without anyone understanding why. Children cried in the early morning without explanation. It wasn't fear of the dark, it was fear of what lurked within it. The elders, especially those who still held old stories, felt their hearts ache as if time were about to repeat itself. It was a feeling of foreboding, of inevitable destiny, as if something that had always been dormant had finally awakened. The Nazgûl's journey was guided by a mixture of instinct and command. They didn't need maps. They felt their way as if drawn by an invisible thread that connected each step to the ring. As they approached the freer and more tranquil regions of Middle-earth, the contrast became even more cruel. Places once known for laughter, music, and simple life now seemed to carry a silent shadow, a threat no one could name. And it is precisely in this kind of environment that the hidden truth about the Nazgûl becomes most evident. They don't just seek, they contaminate. Wherever they go, they leave such a strong emotional trail that even those who have never heard of them instinctively understand that something terrible is approaching. And then the shadow reached the Shire, a place so peaceful, so far removed from the great events of history, that many believed it to be protected by its very simplicity. But simplicity protects no one when darkness decides to move forward. When the first Nazgûl crossed the borders of that verdant territory, something broke in the balance of that small world. The grass seemed to lose its color, the wind grew heavier, and even the smell of the earth changed. The hobbits couldn't explain it, but they felt an unease that made no sense to a people accustomed to tranquil nights and bountiful harvests. Their presence there was not merely a search, it was an announcement, a reminder that no land, however peaceful, was beyond the reach of ancient forces. And this reveals a profound aspect of this journey. The hunt for the ring-bearer was not just a mission, it was a symbol. A symbol that the shadow was willing to cross any boundary and shatter any illusion of security. The whole of Middle-earth seemed to shrink before this silent march. The Nazgûl, for their part, felt no hurry, no doubt, no curiosity. They advanced with the mentality of those who already know the end of the story, as if destiny were a straight and inevitable line. Each of their steps represented the expansion of the Eye's dominion. And, although none of them had emotions of their own, there was a kind of instinctive urgency that guided them. The desire, or reflection of Sauron's desire, to recover that which defines him. The One Ring was not merely an object, it was part of the Dark Lord himself, his strength, his identity, his possibility of absolute transformation over Middle-earth. And it's fascinating to realize how, even without emotions, the Nazgûl carried a presence that stirred the emotions of others. They were the endpoint of anyone who saw them, a journey of fear. And as they advanced, each small village, each narrow road, each peaceful forest, transformed into the stage of an invisible tension. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing that this moment would change everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The pursuit, which began as an inevitable march, guided by the almost instinctive certainty that the bearer could not escape, reached its breaking point at the ford of Bruinen. Until that moment, the Nazgûl advanced, as if they were part of destiny itself, figures that nothing could stop. Not ordinary. Weapons, not walls, not prayers. Their presence was so overwhelming that many believed the journey would end right there, with Frodo succumbing to the weight of fear. But what happened on the banks of that river showed something that until then seemed impossible. The shadow can also be wounded by the light. When Frodo, weakened by the blow of Morgul's blade, reached the ford, the Nazgûl did not hesitate. They advanced with the automatic confidence of those who no longer know doubt. The river seemed an insignificant obstacle. After all, for creatures who lived between the world of the living and the unseen world, water should not represent any threat. But Bruinen was no ordinary river. It carried not only water, but the protection of Elrond, an ancient force that united tradition, wisdom and purity, elements that for the Nazgûl were as lethal as any elven sword. The first spectral horse touched the current, and at that precise moment something changed. The water, once calm, began to stir as if it had a life of its own. An intense glow spread across the waves, and an energy that the Nazgûl could not comprehend began to permeate the air. The sensation that overwhelmed them was not physical pain. They no longer possessed real bodies, but a kind of internal rupture, a profound displacement in the essence that held them together. It was as if each part of them was being pulled in different directions. The waves surged suddenly, shaping themselves into the forms of wild white horses, erupting with holy fury. The emotional impact of that onslaught was as powerful as the magical impact. The light, which the Nazgûl had always avoided, violently enveloped them, breaking the momentary bond that held their physical forms together. One of them tried to resist, raising his sword as if that could stop the advancing force, but it was useless. No weapon forged by mortal hands could withstand that current. And then came the strangest sensation, something many believed they were, no longer capable of feeling: fear, or at the very least a distorted memory of it. It was as if a very distant echo of a human feeling awakened only to be immediately ripped away. It wasn't the common fear, the kind that paralyzes. It was an empty, almost intellectual fear, as if they perceived they were facing something that surpassed their capabilities, but no longer had the emotional structure to react as humans would. This emotional revelation, involuntary, disconcerting, highlighted something few realize. Even creatures shaped by darkness carry traces of their former nature, even if they are only shadows of what they once were. The water surged against them with increasing force. The spectral forms of the Nazgûl began to dissolve, dissolving like black dust swept away by the wind. The horses vanished first, swallowed by the current, and soon after, the spectres themselves were swept away. Their once imposing robes floated empty for a few moments before sinking. The river of Elrond not only defeated them, it exposed the fragility that lay beneath their invincible appearance. But the defeat wasn't merely physical. The internal impact was even greater. As they were swept away by the enchanted waters, part of their essence dispersed, as if fragments of who they were and who they had once been were ripped away by the current. Many describe this moment as the first time in centuries that the Nazgûl felt a profound disconnection, a rupture so intense it almost seemed like a death within death. It was a cruel reminder of the hidden truth behind servitude. They were powerful, yes, but not indestructible. And above all, they were not complete. The journey that transformed them into spectres had cost them so much that, faced with the brilliance of Bruinen, it seemed clear that little remained within them. When they were finally taken back to Mordor, reduced to fragments, wrapped in rags, shapeless and voiceless, a silent question remained. One of those questions not asked in battle, not recorded in books and not spoken aloud. A question that, ironically, can only arise when someone experiences loss at its deepest level. What remains of a king when even fear becomes just a distant memory? Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and if you've made it this far, walking with me through every detail of this dark journey, you've probably already realized how each layer of the Nazgûl's story reveals something greater about power, choices, and the consequences that never cease to catch up with us. It's exactly this kind of depth that I like to explore here. And if this content resonated with you, perhaps it's worth subscribing to the channel to continue following these journeys into the hidden side of Middle-earth. Also, take this opportunity to tell me in the comments that you made it to the end. Say where you're watching from and what time it is there now. I like this exchange because it gives the feeling that we're all walking together, each in a different corner of the map, but connected by the same curiosity. And of course, if this video has accompanied you well so far, leave a like, not as an obligation, but as that natural gesture of someone who feels the conversation was worth the time. There's a video over here that complements this topic. Click on it and continue watching it.